Hallo und herzlich willkommen beim 38. DocFest München. A warm welcome to the 38th edition of DocFest München. I am Vera Drude, I'm a filmmaker and happy to host this talk tonight about the film Magic Mountain. Wir sprechen jetzt über den Film Magic Mountain und wir sprechen auf Englisch, denn die beiden Filmemacher sprechen Englisch. Please welcome the directors Mariam Chachia and Nick Voigt. Hello, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for this film. You told me before that it was a long process to make this film. Why?
Yeah, so maybe I will start with this because it's about my personal story. And so we started shooting in 2014. And it was a year when, after 7 years of my recovery, finally I met Nick and I shared my biggest secret of my life, that I was ill. And of course, like being European, for Nick it was like a big surprise that I kept as a secret that I had tuberculosis. But at that time in Georgia it was very big stigma, and I appeared like one of the first patients of tuberculosis who openly said that I'm ex-patient. And so when we talked after, we understood that we need to do something. And that time it was an idea to make a film which will tackle stigma and to go to that place and meet these dead people. And I will also mention that that time it wasn't new antibiotics yet, and tuberculosis was mutated, which means that people, the Abbas Toumani Hospital was some kind of a waiting room for some people, because they were just waiting for some new medicines, and yeah, it was like a more palliative treatment there. So we thought that we will go to that hospital and we will meet these people, and we try to prepare ourselves that it will be a really very depressive, very dark place. But surprisingly, it was totally opposite. Maybe you can speak what was there?
Yeah, we started shooting in 2014, in November 2014. Mariam and I had actually just met earlier on that year. And when we got there, it was unknown for both of us what would happen. And that, I mean, I live in Georgia now. I've been living there for nearly 8 years, and I understand Georgian. But that time I didn't have any idea what I was getting myself in for. And a lot of the patients there are ex-convicts. They caught tuberculosis in prison, typically, and then were transferred to this hospital. So they were quite unruly, as you saw, violent sometimes. They liked drinking, and it was, for me, an eye-opener to see this situation where people are allowed to drink in a hospital, allowed to smoke, and so on. We kept filming for 5 years, though, because there was something about this place that captivated us.
There is a say that if you once go to Abbas Toumani, you will always go back. So, and I think it's also happened with us, because we went first time in 2014, and after we kept going back again and again, after 5 years, every time we were promising to each other that this will be the last time we go there, we will film, and after we will edit the film. And finally, really after 5 years, I think, we say that, yeah, it's enough. We have about like 400 hours of footage, so now let's make a film. We made a film. We called our French editor, Céline Kelepekis. She helped us to edit the film. And after we found out that Abbas Toumani Hospital will be sold and something might happen. And of course, we moved this film and we said, now we need to continue again. Yeah, it's for us, of course, when everything happened and finished like that, finally Abbas Toumani Hospital was demolished, it was very sad, but somehow it was a relief for us that we don't have any reason to go back and film something.
In these 9 years, we got married, we had a child, we built a house, and we made 4 other films. Yeah. So also finishing the film is quite a relief.
I just want to add something that of course, the situation there, it's very unusual for a hospital, but on the same time that the place where you are just waiting and you don't know how long you should wait, of course it's becoming not really hospital and more your house, because there is for example, Ale was waiting for 11 years in that hospital, and it's a quite long time to be in one place. Yeah, but most important for me was, and most surprising for me was, that the situation was very light there, even though that people had a very dark background, that they were living just for that day, and they tried to be funny, they tried to be next to each other. Of course, they maybe had a different attitude about life, but they didn't. They wasn't in a depression, and they didn't make their life difficult. Yeah.
Are there any questions in the audience? Please feel free to ask. Yes. Wait. You'll get a microphone, so will be heard on the recording. Thank you.
Do you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I was all the time very worried about the infection. When you go there from outside, is it possible to be infected, or the doctors? How does it work?
Yeah, tuberculosis is very contagious, and I think the reason we were able to film there at all was because Mariam was an ex-patient, first of all, but also she wasn't afraid. She took off her mask. In most of the shots you see that she's not actually wearing the mask, and it took down this barrier. But I was totally different. I was very afraid, and I always had my mask on. I did a lot of research before we went there, where I found out you have to always have the windows open, stay no longer than 20 minutes in a room with someone. And I even had one situation where we took a day off from filming, and one of the patients showed me around and to get some photographs, and then he took me to his room and wanted to have a vodka with me. But I panicked. I was like, no, I'm not sharing a glass with you. I'm not going to drink with you. And I learned something that day, that you have to drink with Georgians, because after that he took me to another room, and he stood there, arms wide, and said, take a picture. And I was about to take a picture, and there was a man on the bed I hadn't seen before, jumped up and punched this guy in the head, and then came for me. And I was lucky I was near the door. I jumped out and held the door closed. And Marika managed to sort the situation out. But this was the head of the patients, so to speak. In prison terms, he was the boss, and he didn't want to be photographed. So, and it is dangerous, not just the tuberculosis, but the other aspects as well. Since then, on every film, I drink with anyone who asks.
It's not clever to be without mask, because with tuberculosis there is one very important thing to know, that when you catch tuberculosis, it's not that some like another illness or virus that you don't have immunity. And if you catch the second time, so you are resistant of the antibiotics which you already had. So that's how this tuberculosis is mutated. But for example, now when I think about myself, I think it was very stupid. But that time I was so excited, and first 2 days I was wearing a mask, but I understood that this mask became some kind of a wall in between me and the character, and I was so curious to know about them, so I understood that I prefer to be without masks than to have this barrier, but it was very stupid. No, nothing happened, no.
Are there any other questions? Just wait a second, the microphone's coming. Thank you.
Hi, I have two questions really. The first one is, did the special place and the history of the place mean something to the people, in particular to the patients? And the second question is, it struck me that the medical staff to a large degree spoke Russian while the patients were speaking Georgian, and the way they also presented themselves really stood out to me as that as if there were two societies, the staff society and the patient society. So I wonder whether they connected at all and whether there were social relationships across these two societies and how you view this.
Yeah, thanks for the question. You're right. The doctors and nurses had been there their whole working life, since they were adults. Most of them would have gone there when they were about 18 and started learning after, or 19, and learning after their education and becoming doctors. So they'd been there for, 40 years, some of them. They were all over 70. And that was their life, and they were educated in the Soviet times, and they were nostalgic for the Soviet times, and for them the building was their life. It was everything, and it represented their past glory. But for the patients, it didn't mean that. For the patients were younger and had grown up in had lived through a civil war and lived through another war, and had grown up in a country that was much more difficult and violent, and they had no nostalgia for Soviet times, I suppose.
And it's a very interesting question, but also that I will try to explain what kind of a relationship and what was in the hospital, because mainly these people, the patients, didn't have anyone, for example, anyone who will care about them. So they were really rejected from the families, from the friends, because they were in a prison and because that they were ill with tuberculosis. So they were living there alone, and they knew that the only people who were looking after them and who cared about them were doctors, and they had very really good attitude. They really respect them, but try to not make them angry. But it was also very interesting. My family I come from the doctor's family, so I know that it wasn't normal, but soon I understood that how the doctors of Abastomani behaved, it was really very human behavior towards the patients, because they knew that they don't have anyone and they had really very, very difficult life, so they understood that to teach them now how they need to behave or how you need to deal with your life, it's too late. So they just try to help them, and they just do everything, that they will drink pills, and after some time maybe they will recover. Yeah, that was their idea, and they had quite good relationship with each other.
Any other questions? In the back? I don't know, I'm sorry. We can start over here because you're closer, but I won't forget you, okay?
First of all, thanks for this impressive film. Thank you very much. I do have two questions. The one question is there any other location like this hospital today? And is tuberculosis already a topic in Georgia? This is the first one. And the second one is, what was the greatest challenge in making this film?
That was the last tuberculosis sanatorium in Georgia. So there are no more like it. And tuberculosis has been a topic in Georgia for a long time. And with the mutation of tuberculosis, that it's developed a resistance to antibiotics. We have TB, and MDR, which is multi-drug resistant TB, and XDR, which means that it's resistant to all drugs. So that's an issue and a problem, but it's not talked about still as much as it should be. So yeah, that's a problem.
And I'll add again that the place had an amazing history besides this Romanovs history, because during the Soviet time, you know how the Soviets like to have some kind of different locations, which was like, so Soviets built, there were 7 huge sanatoriums in one village. And this whole village was fenced off, and no one could enter there without special visa or special, I don't know, the document to go in. But this was placed mainly for tuberculosis patients. But the funny thing, I don't know if it's funny or not, but even if someone could recover earlier, they didn't have right to leave the place during 2 years. But the place was amazing because at every weekend they had amazing parties there. The musicians were invited. It was like a dancing halls, it was screening halls, and it was totally separate, like a life for elite tuberculosis patients. Yeah.
And I think the second question was, what was the biggest, the hard challenge to make the film, right? Yeah.
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's for me it was that it was so many information. It was such a huge, I think, information that how to make in one film. I think it was really difficult, and even like to combine history, human stories, my personal story, and also a lot of things which we didn't manage to fit in one film. I think for me it was like a biggest challenge.
I think that's it. Finding the voice of the film was a challenge. After the building came down, after we filmed the demolition, we understood that the film was more than just the lives of the people in the hospital that we filmed. We realized that it was a wider topic, and how we could make that into a film was, I think, the biggest challenge. Because after we finished filming in 2019, May, it took us until 2023, January, to finish it. So that was quite a challenge.
Can we have the question in the back? Do we have another mic? No. Okay, she's coming. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you very much for this beautiful documentary. My question was, what was the first reaction, the first time you arrived to shoot this movie, you had this project, how did all the patients or all the team react, like this idea of being filmed in their daily life? Did you have different types of reaction, people who would not want to be filmed or such things, or in the contrary, super happy to tell their story? How was their reactions?
Yeah, I mean, when we first got there, even though I was there with the camera, they all thought Mariam was a new patient. So they came to her, and that was, and then she told them that she'd recovered, that she was an ex-patient, and they were super curious after that. You know, it gave them hope in a way that, oh, maybe there's hope for us as well. So that was the initial reaction, and absolutely there were quite a number of patients who did not want to be filmed. So also that was a challenge when editing, that we knew that there were certain people who we couldn't include in the shots. And that's because of the stigma that existed, and to a certain extent still exists. They don't want to be shown. To them, nobody knew where they were. They just disappeared for a while, and they didn't want to be shown. Yeah,
But they were really super happy when they saw me, mainly because really it was some kind of a hope that, oh, maybe after a few years we'll be also out and we will live our life.
Do we have time for another question? One last question, okay. I'm sorry, he was first, but they will be here.
Yeah, I was wondering, I mean, when I think of masks, I think of COVID, of course. Yeah. And do you think working with these patients and filming them for so many years has sort of radically changed your view on sort of, I don't know, airborne diseases which need to be contained, and sort of has given you a different COVID experience the most?
Well, I don't think he gave us a different COVID experience. I think it was unavoidable. But I do think that the attitude or the fear that I had before going in and then realizing that actually it was unfounded probably stopped me being so afraid during COVID times as well. Because I think, you know, also she wasn't wearing a mask and she was fine. So that's also the other side of it. So I don't know whether it changed our COVID experience, but definitely it made me think about how easy it is to stigmatize people based on some information that you get. Yeah.
Perhaps one more question. When did the idea come to sort of address the hospital as a character in the film?
Do we have time?
Can you give a short answer?
Short
maybe?
answer,
And
okay.
then I think you'll be around, so
Yeah, we'll be here, yeah.
Okay, so everybody gets their chance.
In the end, because I really struggled to put the voiceover in the film because I don't like voiceovers and it always confused me when I hear my voice. But finally, so Nick rewrote this and said that this is what we need to do. That's all.
All right, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for coming.